Hello, Year 4. Oh my goodness. When did you make the connection? Chapter 41. Pip and George Stone could have embraced or shaken hands, but neither of them made any move towards the other, nor did they say a word. They just stood there in silence, the past 7 years separating them like a physical barrier. It's funny, thought Pip. For 7 years I would have given anything to see my father, and now I've found him I can't think of anything to say. George Stone turned the knife over and over in his hands, staring at the blade and the fine 5-fingered star carved into the handle. Finally, he lifted his head and looked at Pip. That's a good knife. I know. I'm glad you still have it. He handed the knife back to Pip, handle first. Look after it. I will, said Pip. He took the knife and slid it into its scabbard. George Stone smiled, but didn't say another word. Staring at the dishevelled middle-aged man who stood before him, Pip wondered whether he would look like that one day. Would his chin be covered with scabs and stubble, and his nose broken in 10 different places? Would he have bloodshot eyes and bad breath? Pip hoped not. He searched his father's face, trying to see some resemblance to himself, something that suggested a bond between them. But he couldn't find anything. Did his eyes really look like that? He hoped not. He certainly couldn't see himself in them. If he hadn't known the Bearkeeper and George Stone were the same person, his father, he'd never have guessed. George suddenly said, Are you hungry? No. You look thin. Doesn't your mother feed you properly? Of course she does. Let's have something to eat. Sit down, I'll get some food. Pip wasn't hungry, but he had no wish to quarrel with his father about something so trivial, so he righted an upturned stool and sat at the table. George fetched a loaf of bread, a jug of beer and a muslin bag holding a soft white cheese. He drank a gulp from the jug and handed it to Pip, apologising for the lack of cups. Pip took a sip. The warm beer had a bitter taste. George squatted by a bucket of water and washed his face, cleaning off the dried blood, then joined Pip at the table. He broke the bread and opened the muslin bag, flopping the soft cheese onto the table. They ate in silence. For years, Pip had puzzled over an impossible conundrum. How might his life have been different if his father hadn't died? How would he himself be different? Would he be stronger or braver? Would he have more friends? Would he be happier? He'd often walked through the woods, imagining how much better things would have been if only his father were there too. Together, they would have made traps for rabbits, tracked deers, watched birds, picked blackberries, discussed everything. Over and over again, Pip had imagined all the questions he would ask, the secrets he would share, the intimate conversations they would have, father and son, best friends. And now that he had the feeling that if his father had stayed rather than left, his life would have been much worse. Imagine spending every day with this man, waking to find him in the house, eating opposite him every night, looking at the scar on his forehead, staring into his bloodshot eyes, and worst of all, sitting for hours in silence, no one knowing what to say. For the first time in weeks, Pip felt a sudden stab of nostalgia for his home. He wondered how his mother had been. He missed his sisters. He even wanted to see Samuel. Well, he would soon. He'd go back there, just for a day or two. He'd take a holiday from the Globe and go to Mildmay. He looked across the table at his father. George Stone lifted his head, met Pip's eyes for a moment, then returned his attention to his food. Neither of them said a word. Pip remembered the threats that the weasel had made. Were they real? Would the weasel really come back in 2 days' time and kill George Stone? If this was the last time he ever saw his father, was there anything he wanted to say or ask? He thought through the hundreds of questions that he'd once wanted to ask his father, but none of them seemed important anymore. Only one question really mattered, so he asked it. He said, Why did you leave? Leave where? Home? That was a long time ago. I can't remember. You must be able to remember, said Pip. What happens? Were you really working? Working? No. Your mother and I had an argument, that's all. Yet another argument. I said I was leaving. She said nothing would make her happier. I gave her the knife, told her to give it to you, and walked out. She didn't try to stop me. I came straight to London, did the walk in a day and a half. I could walk fast in those days. Didn't have this. He slapped his leg, the one that made him limp. Pip said, "And then what happened? Why didn't you come back?" "Come back where?" "Home, to see me." "When?" "Any time. You've been gone for 7 years. Mum told me you were dead. Why didn't you come back? I was there. You knew I was. Why didn't you come and see me?" "Because I was in France." When he arrived in London, George explained he tried to get a job as a soldier or a bodyguard, but no one would take him. He was too old and unfit, having not fought in a war for several years. People thought he'd gone soft. So I left the country. I travelled round Europe for 3 years, maybe 4, working as a mercenary, hiring myself out to different armies in different countries, but things didn't go well. I'd lost my touch. It's a young man's game, killing people for money. Returning to London, he'd searched for work for several weeks without any success, then finally managed to talk himself into a job at the Bear Garden. The owners, Philip Henslow and Edward Allen, remembered him as an honest fighter. When he was a soldier, during the empty weeks between campaigns, he had appeared at several London theatres as a performer, battling a bear or wrestling other unemployed soldiers. Although he was too old for that now, Henslow and Allen agreed to employ him as a bearkeeper. "They didn't pay much," explained George, "and he had expensive tastes, which was how he managed to get himself in trouble with some bad people. I was stupid enough to try and gamble myself out of debt, but each bet just dug me in a deeper hole. Now I owe someone a lot of money, and he wants it back." "The Weasel? Who?" Pip explained why he'd chosen the nickname. George grinned. "His real name's Andrew Nash, but the Weasel suits him much better. I owe him a lot of money and I don't have any way to get it back again." "And that's why you sent him to rob us?" George looked surprised. "You know that?" Pip nodded. "I'm sorry," said George. "It was a stupid thing to do, but I was desperate. If I don't pay this money to the Weasel, he's going to kill me." "So you sent him to kill us?" "No," said George. "It wasn't like that. He'd never have killed you. He was just going to take the Smith's money, that's all. Unfortunately, the Smith didn't have any money. The Weasel, got a few quid which kept him quiet for a while, but now he wants the rest." Pip was sure his father was lying. He remembered the chilling cruelty in the Weasel's face as he stood over Samuel Smith. Even worse, he remembered looking through the open doorway and seeing Tooth pressing a knife against Bridget's white throat. The memory of that sight, Bridget's eyes wide with terror, made him furious. He said, "How could you do that?" "I didn't have any choice," said George. "Of course you did." "I didn't, Pip. You have to understand. If I could have done anything else, I would have. You can be sure of that." Coming here had been a mistake, thought Pip. The worst mistake of his life. What had he learnt? That his father was a liar, a cheat, a gambler, a mercenary, and worst of all, willing to sacrifice other people's lives to save himself a few pounds. "I wish I'd stayed in the Globe," thought Pip. "I wish I'd never found my father. I wish today had never happened." If only he'd done what his mother suggested years ago and accepted Samuel Smith as his new father. He was going to walk out now and never return. Never even think about his father again. From today, he didn't even have a father. If people asked him, he'd say his father was dead. There was just one more thing he had to do before he left. He wanted a proper answer to his question. If he asked it again, his father would probably just dodge it again or lie, but he had to try. He craved an answer which would explain why he'd gone 7 years without a father. He said, "I still don't understand. You still haven't explained it. Why did you leave us?" George paused for a long time before answering, as if he was searching for the right words. Then he just shrugged. and said, "I don't know." "You must know," said Pip. "I suppose," said George. He sighed, as if Pip were pestering him with completely unjustified questions, the sort of things that no one had any right to ask. "Your mother and I, we weren't having fun." "Fun?" "That's right. Fun? You'll understand when you're older." "I want to understand now. What do you mean you weren't having fun?" George sighed again. "I was bored." "Bored of what?" "Country life didn't suit me," said George. "I'm a soldier, a drinker, a gambler. I like having fun." Fun, thought Pip. Fun, what does that mean? He remembered all the time he'd slept in the woods, wandering alone for hours, trying to understand what it meant to grow up without a father. All those hours had been wasted. They were pointless, meaningless. All that time his father had been alive, working as a soldier, travelling around Europe, having fun. Because he'd been bored of living in the countryside with his wife and his son. Pip said, "Why couldn't you have fun with us?" "I just couldn't, not as much fun as I had on my own. And that, I suppose, is why I left." "You mean you're selfish?" George thought for a moment. Then he nodded. "Yes, I suppose that's exactly what I mean." He lifted his head and looked at his son, staring him down, willing him to look away first. There was a new expression in George's face, defiant, even proud. "I had to live my life. In that little house with you and your mother, I was dying of boredom. It doesn't sound very nice, Pip, but it's true. It's a simple fact. You have to live your own life. Maybe that means hurting other people. Maybe that means being selfish, but you only get one life. It's yours, no one else's. You have to live it your own way." Pip said, "I'm never going to be like you." "Wait and see," said George Stone. "Just wait and see." Pip wanted to be somewhere else. He didn't know or particularly care where, but he was absolutely sure that he didn't want to be here. He pushed back his chair and stood. "I'm going," he said. Without another word, he turned and walked towards the door. Just as Pip lifted the curtain in the doorway, George sprang up from the table, darted across the room with surprising speed and stopped him. "Wait. Don't go. Not yet. There's something I want to give you." "I'm not interested," said Pip. "Don't you want to see what it is first?" "No." "Yes, you do," said George, grabbing his son's elbow and pulling him. "Come on, this way." Pip tried to free himself, shaking his elbow and pulling away, but his father was much stronger than him. There was no point struggling. He allowed himself to be led under the curtain, into the other room, and down the line of cages. Not a very nice man, it would turn out. I wonder what this gift's going to be. Are you full?